Hi, Paul. Nice to see you, even under these rather odd circumstances. Um, for someone who's been around and seen just about everything and coached in so many different circumstances, what does this season feel like in terms of how you go about and do your job, and how different is all this?
Well, everything, Steve's different. Like there's no normalcy, and that's the one, I don't know, the either a complaint or possibly thing that you enjoyed the most about the NHL in the past is you could take a look at your day 6 months in advance and know exactly what you're doing. It was just so routine. And now there's just no more routine. So the challenge is great, but exciting. Like you don't spend a lot of time complaining about the extra time you have to put in just dealing with logistics. You spend an awful lot of time being grateful for being back to work. The idea that you could be in the league at a time where there was a Canadian division, right? Like this is about as, I don't know if cool is the right word, but when you're growing up, or at least, in Sault Ste. Marie, for me, yeah, I guess my dad was a Detroit fan, but there were really only Canadian teams, right? There were Toronto and Montreal and Edmonton, and that was the NHL as a young kid. Was always kind of that idea. You cheered for one of those Canadian teams, and then 50 years later, you're coaching in a league that has a Canadian division, and all of the excitement that goes into it, the scrutiny, the pressure. Truly, I mean, you can't have one without the other. So what I would take fans in the building and no Canadian division over the Canadian division and no fans, because could you imagine that, right? Full buildings, a Canadian division. And now I'm just daydreaming, but everything has changed. There's an underlying awareness of the hardship that a lot of people are going through. And be mindful of that when you speak. But in our small little hockey world, this is an unbelievably cool event, and I'm really glad I'm in Canada when it happened.
We'll go next to Ken Weeb from Sportsnet. Go ahead, Ken.
Paul, what can you tell us about your lineup, and also what allowed Logan Stanley to make his debut tonight over some of the other alternatives?
So Ehlers is in, Patrik Laine is out, upper body day to day. Jansen Harkins will come into the lineup. Logan Stanley goes in, so that DeMello and Pullman are both out. Logan, if there has been, there's silver linings to this whole situation there, and one of them is he got a really extended conditioning period, and he made the most of it. So he came back as a man, bigger, stronger, faster, able to close gaps. So he really, in our mind, kind of turned pro this year. Very unfortunate for all of these kind of young defensemen that we have, there were no exhibition games. So he's going to get thrown right into the fire. And we tried to pick the hardest team for him to play against. So awful lot of skill and an awful lot of speed. What a great, if you look just at the positives, which I think in these days is the best way to look at things. He's a Kitchener-Waterloo area kid that would have grown up watching the Toronto Maple Leafs, turns pro, and his first NHL game is in Toronto. So we're happy for him. He's done the work to give himself the opportunity. Clearly, it's a great test for him with the players and the speed that he's going to see, but a great measuring stick to where he's at in his young career.
Go next to Michael Trakos. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, Paul. Always good talking to you. Just about Patrik Laine. I know he's not playing tonight, but for a guy who was coming off that great performance in game one, he's a player who seems to rely more on confidence maybe than most other players. How do you go about, I guess, working with him so that confidence level doesn't wane this year, in a year where there's going to be a lot of questions as we go on as to his future here?
Well, unlike time in the past, I feel like we have a place to point to where his confidence base comes from. I mean, he came to camp and worked like a pro. Like he's in good shape. He's big. He's strong. But that doesn't matter. What matters was from the very first drill, he just pushed himself, and everybody noticed it, right? 15 minutes into practice, they're going, who's this 6'5" guy that battling in the corners with unbelievable hands? So that's where his performance. So take away, I mean, the goals, obviously, That I think we've always known about Patrik. You've seen it from his day one in the NHL. But the play away from the puck, the battling in the corner, if you watch that Calgary game, that's a different player than most of you have seen, different player than we've seen. This guy now is morphing into a dominant power forward. And that's where we point to. When we would get to a point, if we got to a point where he wasn't scoring when he came back and that frustration started to build, we would remind him of the training camp and the work that he put in. And the payoff was the way he played, the way he looked opening night.
We'll go next to Mike McIntyre from the Free Press. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Gregor. Thanks, Paul. Can you give us just any more about the timeline of this, I guess, with Patrik? Is it related at all to the game on Thursday, Paul, or is this something that just kind of crept up after the 2 off days at practice? And obviously he tried to give it a go again this morning.
So nothing more. There wasn't anything in the game that he was worried about. He was aware of it, but it was minor. And then he came out and couldn't warm it up. Like it couldn't get to the point where he felt comfortable with it. Treated it, rested it, same thing, wants to be sure that he can perform with it. We got to get this thing healed. So I don't have a timeline for you. I'm not looking at this unless something changes as a long term. The day-to-day is an honest assessment in my mind of where he's at. It's going to get questioned because we happen to play 6 in the next 9. So we want to get him back in the lineup. You wish you had more time between games to let it heal. We don't, but we won't put him back in until he's confident that he can be the player that he was.
Go next to Sean Reynolds from Sportsnet. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey, Paul. You'd remarked that Logan Stanley had a really great off season. He pointed to the motivation behind that. He wasn't happy with last year, and so wanted to do something about it. It kind of reminds me of when you would talk about Josh Morrissey and how he had that one off season where he took all of his weaknesses and turned them into his strengths. Is it a similar situation? And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about the mindset of your players and kind of using disappointment to fuel themselves.
Yeah, I think what it is a natural stage of turning pro. So these young players, and yeah, they work out and they have great success, right, in their junior careers. And that's why they get drafted in the first round. They're great players. So there isn't really an impetus to change what they're doing. Then they get into the National Hockey League or the American Hockey League, and they realize that these are all and only men out there, and they're powerful and they're strong. And they realize that season that they didn't like wasn't, I didn't have my hands, I wasn't moving the puck, is I've got to become more like my opponents and my teammates. And that's when it kicks in for them. That this is a 12-month job, and it's not occasionally you go into the gym, or you're not occasionally going to work to give your 100%. What you expect out of yourself in terms of returns of play, when you're on the ice, you want to be a great player. Well, you don't get to be average in the 4 or 5 months that you're not playing hockey. So it's certainly a driver. I think it's what it is, an awakening, maybe an awareness. What they've done was good enough to be a good player in junior. And maybe even be a star player, but it is not enough for you to become that kind of player in the NHL. You've got to be elite in your training. You just look around it, and you see it here in Toronto with the top end players. Certainly talk about Mark Scheifele and Blake Wheeler and our leaders, our captains. It's well known what they do in the summer, how hard they work in the summer. I know Logan got to skate with Mark Scheifele a little bit this summer too. That kind of idea, he gets to see what Mark's doing in the summer. You tune in pretty quick. Oh, what I was doing in the past wasn't good enough for me to be a good player in the NHL.
We'll go next to Scott Billick. Go ahead, Scott.
Hey, good morning, Paul. Thanks for doing this. Good afternoon, I guess, there. Just a hockey, I guess, related question when it comes to, so on Thursday you had that 5-forward power play, and I understand it was a 5-on-3, and I'm just wondering, given the way that Blake kind of distributed the puck on the point there, is that something that you'd look at in other situations, maybe in a 5-on-4? Just given how well it seemed to work.
Yeah, you know what? There are times, Scott, when you look back over the last 3 or 4 years, there were some times, and I think about the 4-on-3 in St. Louis in the playoffs where Kyle Connor scored big goal for us in St. Louis. It's something that we've looked at. What we haven't loved is what it's left us, right? What when we pull the extra forward. Now and then Paul Stastny shows up. So we are more open to that idea. We would look at it, but we are aware of. I didn't like the way I ran the power play last year. I'm not apologizing for it. I didn't like the fact that I ran the first unit so hard and so long, but our injuries said there wasn't enough on the second unit for us to not do it that way. If I put Blake up there and let's say I pull Paul Stastny into a normal way we operate, I don't necessarily love what it leaves us. So we'll be careful with it, but I'm not opposed to that idea at all. Hence the 5 forwards that we ran 5-on-3.
I'll go next to Paul Friesen from the Sun. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Gregor. Paul, the way you waxed poetic about the Canadian division there a while back, it sounds like, would you keep it if you could beyond this season when it's necessary and despite the time zones and the air miles and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. But only if I was working in Canada. So if I keep my Jets job, yes. I mean, just the idea is wholly selfish, right? We get to keep all these teams up. The time zones, I mean, we're pretty much stuck in that mentality anyway. I mean, especially if it was, I guess the problem with it though, Paul, is that the best part of this is you're really only playing. We have our own little tiny league here, right? So you're not crossing the border. You're not all over the place. If you added the time zone changes to what our division looks, being in the middle part of Canada, I guess it would be egregious. It doesn't matter because this is never going to happen. So I can say, yeah, I would absolutely love it. It would be just fantastic.
We'll go last question to Mark Masters from TSN. Go ahead, Mark.
Paul, you mentioned Mark Scheifele's work ethic and what he does in the summer. What has stood out the most to you about the way he's come into this season?
He's come in as a leader, right? Not a player in terms of driving practice, driving the style. So we played one game, but you look at the style of hockey that he played in that one game, that was a leader's game, right? He was putting as much into his D zone coverage as he was into his offensive zone play. I know you look at his minutes and they were huge, but they were almost all, a big chunk of those were power play, but his shift length 5-on-5 was a leader's shift length, right? He's not out there for a minute 10 sniffing for points. He's just grinding. So I'm seeing that. That's the natural progression of a guy developing into becoming, your next captain of your team. Every day Mark comes to the rink, he has the advantage of just loving the game, right? You can put him on the ice and leave him there for 3 hours. He'd stay out there. So but to be that guy, to be that face of the franchise, everybody understands that that's the dominant player. You do have to do it at both ends of the rink. You can't for the parity in the league now. You have to be a 200-foot player. I know that term gets used, but you got to be a guy that's willing to dig in his own end, and that's the game he played against Calgary.